Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Still so many questions about the BC election. In an hour, NDP Leader David Eby has scheduled a press conference. We'll bring that to you live on our online platforms coming up at 1 o'clock. Right now, we're asking you, do you think the parties can work together in the legislature? And how can we bridge the polarization among BC voters? After 12:30, the weekend's atmospheric river caused a lot of damage and a number of fatalities. Do we need better planning for these severe weather events? I'm Michelle Elliott. Welcome to BC Today. It is right now the narrowest of margins between the NDP and the Conservatives. 46 to 45 leading or elected candidates, respectively. The Green Party has 2. We still don't know the final result until the final count is completed next week. So, what's the next step? In about an hour, we'll hear what NDP leader David Eby is thinking. He's holding a press conference at 1 o'clock. And again, we'll bring that to you live on our online platforms on YouTube. Search for CBC British Columbia and on our streaming channel, CBC News BC. Now, there's been speculation he might try to court a deal with the Green Party, similar to what happened in 2017. Whatever the outcome, how can the NDP, the Greens, and the Conservatives work together in the legislature? Let us know. Do you think the parties can work together to get things done in BC? And with that popular vote also narrowly split, how can we bridge the polarization in our province? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, and you can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. Our email is bctoday@cbc.ca. And joining me to take your calls is Maxwell Cameron, professor of political science at the University of BC. He specializes in democracy, constitutionalism, and political ethics. Max, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon, Michelle. Good to be with you.
So no one has heard, media anyway, hasn't heard from David Eby since Saturday. We're going to hear from him coming up at 1 o'clock. What are you expecting?
Well, I was struck by his remarks on election night. They seemed sober, contrite. He was clearly reading the results and seeing in the results, on the one hand, evidence of a lot of support on what we might call the progressive side for the NDP and the Greens, and clearly shared values between those two parties, but also a good deal of anger and frustration and pain. And that was channeled in a very unified way by the Conservative Party. And so I expect that what he's going to be doing is looking at these results and reading them carefully and recognizing that if he is able to form government, whether that is a majority, which seems unlikely, or more likely a minority government, possibly with support from the Greens, although they've been through that before and the Greens will have their demands, he's going to need to focus like a laser on the issues that are driving people's discontent: the cost of living, the cost of housing, challenges in public services, above all, healthcare, and so forth. And so I would expect a nod to that. And I hope he also acknowledges that this was a great election, flawless election, and people have behaved well. We just have to wait patiently for the results.
What do you mean by people have behaved well? There were a lot of controversies as well with candidates and, social media posts. There were personal attacks along the campaign.
Yeah, I worry about the erosion of civility, examples of hate speech that came up, misbehavior on the part of some of the candidates, the high level of polarization. This is a deeply polarized province, polarized in socioeconomic and regional terms as well as politically. But what I mean by this being a good election is, Elections BC conducted the election as they always do, in a very high quality professional manner. And I watch very closely among politicians for evidence of anti-democratic behavior. A willingness to question our institutions, to question the results, disrespect for our democratic institutions and processes. And I have to say, I haven't seen that. I do think that for the most part, our politicians are respecting the democratic will of the public, and they're playing by the democratic rules of the game. You can play by those rules in a tough way and be very adversarial, or you can be more collaborative. But as long as you're respecting the outcome and the will of the people, I think that's, unfortunately, we have to acknowledge that as being important in this day and age.
And I'm assuming you're alluding to what happened in the United States.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And not only in the United States, in Brazil, in
Mm.
several other countries, we've seen politicians challenge the result, say, I disagree, that's not what happened, I won, you lost, when they in fact lost. I call
Max Cameron is with me. We're just having some technical issues with our connection with him. Really interesting point there that for all the rhetoric among the candidates between the political parties, that there is this acceptance of the results such as they are right now. And as he said, it's sad that we have to acknowledge that, but here we are. I think we do have Max Cameron back. I'll let him finish his thought there. Hi, Max.
Yeah, just to say that around the world, we've seen this virus of electoral denialism, the fraudulent rejection of elections on the grounds that they were fraudulent when they weren't. And that's very pernicious. And that's the kind of polarization that's very dangerous for our democracy. So we definitely want to keep an eye out for that kind of behavior.
Interesting point. My guest is Max Cameron, UBC political science professor. We are asking you, do you think the parties can work together? Do you see any collaboration in the legislature? And how can we bridge the polarization that appears to be present in our province? 1-800-825-5950. 604-669-3733, and you can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. Carrie Ann is joining us from Surrey. Hi, welcome, Carrie Ann.
Hi, yes, thank you, and I love your show, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
So great question, and one of the things that I think really concerns me is when you ask the question, like, how do we overcome the Great Divide? I think one thing that I think British Columbians haven't been able to focus on is the fact that with the foreign interference scandal and the FBI indictment regarding the Russian influencers specifically targeting Canada, we have an elephant in the room that we haven't even started addressing yet. And although I don't want to target conservatives, the fact of the matter is Russia propaganda has been pushing the conservative agenda. We know that the anti-vax movement, the anti-trans, all of that is all influenced by Russia as well. And until we address that, I don't really know how we can overcome a lot of the misinformation that is out there.
So how much of it is due to, I guess, participation or receiving information or disinformation, as you say, Carrie Ann, online?
It's online. It's where we get our sources from. I also think, although I believe Canadian media does its best to stay away from that, but it's also influenced our day-to-day Canadian media. I think, or at the very least, I believe it is infiltrated to a point where unwittingly we've been having discussions that are influenced by Russia, and we haven't really addressed it. And until we do, we can't really move forward. The divide will keep being there, it makes me very nervous. But we also have, forgive me, but two political leaders, John Rustad and Pierre Poilievre, who I think unwittingly are continuing to promote the Russian propaganda or what the Russians want us to be divided over. And until we address that, how do we overcome that?
Okay. Carrie Ann, thank you so much for your call. Max Cameron, how much of that frustration, there's legitimate frustration over the cost of living and the ongoing crises we have, toxic drugs, but how much of what we're seeing in that divide is how much has the discourse been influenced by foreign actors?
Oh, I think it's very important. Russian, Chinese, other countries, misinformation, disinformation. But even without that, without misinformation, disinformation, social media is having a polarizing effect on us, and in ways that are not at all illegal, but which nonetheless are pushing us into or sorting us into different camps. Now, we have had in BC examples of parties coming together and working collaboratively. And for the beginning part of the pandemic, that's precisely what happened. We had people recognizing that we had a common interest in overcoming COVID. So to me, the question in part goes to how do we get back to a world where parties can collaborate together, where we can agree on basic facts, we can have some trust in our institutions. And when we think about it in those terms, I think we have to confront the fact that for 30 or 40 years, we've lived an economic model that has contributed, has really exacerbated the inequalities in our society, inequalities between rural and urban, inequalities among social classes. And consequently, I think that there has been a real decline in the sense that there are common goods that we share. We still, fortunately, in Canada, have many of those common goods: public healthcare system, public broadcaster, good schools, good infrastructure, educated public. But we have to remember that those things require an investment. Housing is one of those areas where we've dropped the ball. So we need an investment in that. And we need real solutions to the problem of mental health, addiction, homelessness, and poverty. And unless we address those issues, I think we are going to continue to be polarized in ways that could be quite dangerous.
Tony's up next now in Vancouver to comment on polarization in BC. That popular vote, right, shows that 44.5% for the NDP, 43.5% for the Conservatives. So among the popular vote, that is also apparent. Hi, Tony. Thanks so much for calling in.
Yeah, I just want to add that we have to find a common ground between left and right so we all can be happy together, like myself, I'm a Christian. I welcome every religion, right? The same way I think we can apply in politics to find common ground so we can bridge the gap and we love each other instead of hating each other. And that's my message. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Great to hear from you, Tony. Thank you so much for that. Common ground, collaboration. Max, do you see that happening with the politicians as we, once we get the results in the coming weeks following?
I mean, I think, learning to live together, learning to live together in ways that recognize and acknowledge our pluralism, our differences. We do have different views. We have different religions. We have people coming in our society from a wide range of different backgrounds. The beautiful thing about democracy is that if we practice it well, it teaches us how to learn to live together and to achieve common goods and to find the things that we share, as well as the things that we disagree on. And it's okay to disagree, and it's okay to have a certain amount of polarization in our society. In fact, without some polarization, we'd have no reason to fight elections. So we have elections because we do disagree. We are a pluralistic society. But the point is that we agree to disagree in a particular way, in a way that respects the rights and the autonomy of the other. I demand that I have the right to vote or run for office. And in return for that, I insist you have exactly the same rights to run for office, to vote, to participate in the democratic process. Democracy is one of those common goods that actually can serve to pull us together.
In practical terms, what might that look like when you have, the Green Party? People seem to be speculating that they could go into a similar agreement with the NDP, that confidence in supply agreement like in 2017. But they did have a lot of differences on certain issues, including involuntary treatment, for example, and the carbon tax. So is there enough common ground there for the Greens and the NDP?
Well, this is going to be one of the questions that I think David Eby is going to need to address. If he has, as we now think, 46 seats, and the Conservatives have 45, and the NDP hold the balance, one option for him would be to say, I'm going to govern as if I was in a majority, and let the other parties decide if they want to vote non-confidence, and that will trigger an election. And I think we ought to remember, even though Mr. Rustad says he's going to bring the NDP down at the first opportunity, how happy would British Columbians be if immediately after a throne speech, there's a vote that brings the government down and we're back in an election in just a couple of months? I don't think people would praise that. I don't think people would be pleased by it. So the Conservatives are going to have to think carefully about when to pull the trigger if that's what they want to do. Likewise for the Greens. They may decide we don't want a supply and confidence arrangement. We will simply support the government on an issue by issue, vote by vote basis. Or they may go back to a supply and confidence arrangement, in which case you put into place not only a core set of concerns that you're going to work together on, but some kind of mechanism for resolving disputes as they arise. And I think, quite frankly, that arrangement worked very well. The CASA arrangement after 2017 worked for 3 years. It could have worked for the full term, had it not been the case that John Horgan, the premier at the time, decided to pull the plug, striving to get a majority. And here again, we see this logic, the winner-take-all logic of our system is politicians hanker after majorities rather than having to work together with other political parties. And I think that's really a major problem in our political culture. We need to develop more of a culture of an assumption that nobody necessarily is going to have all of the power. And they therefore have to learn how to share that power and work together more collaboratively in the legislature with other political parties.
Let's take another call here asking you, do you think that the parties can work together in the legislature to get things done in BC? And how can we bridge the polarization among BC voters? Robert is our next caller now in Abbotsford. Hi, Robert.
Hello. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I don't believe the parties are going to be able to work all that well together, particularly the Conservatives or the NDP. And I'm not sure about the Greens because, about the little agreement that broke up with Horgan and whatever. But the point is that we have to start with the idea that there are basic facts. You might recall when Donald Trump was first elected, there was the issue with, things not being quite straight. And his press secretary, Kellyanne Conway, said, but there are alternate facts.
Alternative facts,
no,
right?
There are not alternate facts. There are facts or facts. And, like, for instance, let's say we just pick one fact. Well, SOGI. SOGI seems to be working. According to the experts, it's helping children be more accepting of each other and the bullying is reduced. And yet you have one party, that says, no, we're going to put some kind of other anti-bullying program in. Well, why would you mess with something that's working? And students are becoming more accepting of each other. It's part of the, they just don't like that particular program. Or safe supply. We have the chief medical officer and the retired coroner in this province saying, we need to have safe supply. That's going to be making people safer. And yet all sorts of people seem to believe that letting organized crime have our drug distribution system with poisonous drugs seems to be okay. We'll just continue on with that instead of look at the strain that goes on our medical personnel. I have to rush out and save these people who are going through all sorts of issues because of poisonous drugs. With safe supply, that would certainly reduce the strain on them. We already have a safe supply program in this province, and like every other province, it's called the liquor store. And people go down to the liquor store to get their safe supply of drugs. But there has to be some acceptance that there are some facts. The world is not flat; it is round, and yet you
will have people who argue.
One party that's saying, that is no, that's flat.
Yeah.
And so until people accept the basic facts, and some of the facts may be a little hard to accept for some groups, like for instance. People were voting because they thought that they were voting to get rid of Trudeau, the Trudeau Liberals, with the BC Liberals. Really, there's also the responsibility to be informed. Like people are talking about their freedoms. I have freedom to do this. But nowhere does it mention I have a responsibility to be informed when I'm making an informed decision. Just about COVID, I don't want to take the COVID shot. Well, you have a responsibility to make sure other people are not affected. If you refuse to take the shot so that you won't spread the disease.
Robert,
this is part of the thing that goes with the plan of being a citizen.
Thank you so much for the call. A lot of points there, and I think that's a great point to put to you, Max. You talked about the reliance on institutions. Still, is that being eroded at? And is reliance on facts being eroded? Is belief in the things that are scientific and accepted scientific knowledge, is that being eroded?
Oh, I think so. I think the caller is absolutely right on that. I appreciate his observations, and I think that we do need to honor facts. We do need to honor evidence. These are actually ways of allowing us to process our differences without necessarily, getting into intractable conflicts. But there are also values, and parties reflect different values, and they balance those values in different ways. Often at stake are rights, your rights versus the rights of others. And finding that balance is part of what the political process is all about. Elections are part of it, but it's also how you govern and how, as a political party, you frame those choices and the balance of rights and values before the electorate. And I think one of the problems that we have today in our democracy is our political parties. Our political parties are a problem. We can't have a democracy without political parties. But parties have become simply vehicles for candidates to run for election. We've lost the sense in which parties are grounded in society, have roots in our communities, are run democratically, where the rank and file, the grassroots, actually has a say. And I would say that one of the reasons why Rustad has been so powerful is because he reflects a kind of grassroots upsurge that wants change. And to the degree that a party channels that, it can be in good shape. And you've got to be careful when you're in government that you lose that connection with the grassroots and no longer are a voice for all of the membership of the political party. And I think that that's a really important thing. We need to democratize our political parties and ensure that they are functioning organic institutions with roots in society.
Max, it's been very good to speak with you today. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Max Cameron, professor of political science at UBC. He specializes in constitutionalism, democracy, and political ethics. It's 12:27 now. Well, we are taking your reaction to the election. We took your calls yesterday and we got these emails. Sheila writes, if the BC United Party had not bailed, this election would have had a very different outcome in votes. I feel bad for those who wanted to vote in the middle rather than left versus right. Not enough choice was offered. Anna writes, I'm delighted with the strong showing by the Conservatives. I think what most CBC listeners are missing is how frustrated and fed up so many of us are with the current government. Case in point, crack pipe vending machines, catch and release homelessness. Meanwhile, the middle class continued to be ignored and taxed up the wazoo. The carbon tax is going to impact the middle lower class most and do very little to actually address climate change. David writes from Comox, where he says the results perfectly illustrate the need for proportional representation. He writes a Conservative candidate was elected with a little over 38% of the vote, while nearly 60% voted for the NDP or Green candidates. Given all the polarized rhetoric in this election, can we expect a Conservative member to fairly represent the 60% of constituents with different values? And Jacob writes from the West Vancouver Capilano riding, it's deeply concerning that the ecological crisis was not a central issue for either the NDP or Conservatives, even more so that the Conservatives denied that it's a crisis. I'm also disappointed that Sonia Furstenau did not get her seat. I think due to our first past the post system, people felt compelled to vote NDP rather than Green, afraid of splitting up the vote. The results also show me we need to do more to lessen the division and hate and to communicate the urgency of ecological crises and social issues. Thanks so much for your emails. You can always send them to us, bctoday@cbc.ca. This is BC Today here on CBC, live on Radio 1, CBC Television, live streaming as well. And once again, we will bring you live a press conference held by David Eby, the NDP leader, coming up in about half an hour. So we'll extend the show on our online platforms. You can watch that press conference live on YouTube. Just search for CBC British Columbia, and you can use our live streaming channel as well. It's CBC News BC. We are taking your calls right now, asking you, do you think the parties can work together in the legislature? And what about polarization? Can we bridge that polarization among British Columbians? How can we do so? Lots of thoughts in our first half hour. We're going to hear from Clay in Surrey and Trace in Vancouver coming up, and would love to hear from you. All of that coming right up after this CBC News Update with Robert Zimmerman.
Good afternoon. It appears the atmospheric river this past weekend may have led to another death. A search is on for 59-year-old Robert Belding, who was last seen Sunday walking his dog near the swollen Coquitlam River. A landslide on Saturday, meanwhile, in Coquitlam led to the death of a 57-year-old woman, and a body has been recovered and another person is presumed dead after 2 vehicles were found submerged in a river near Bamfield on Vancouver Island. Kamloops Mayor Reed Hamer-Jackson says he has no plans to move his office to the basement floor at City Hall. The decision was made earlier this month by the rest of council based on claims WorkSafe BC complaints were filed against the mayor. And the city of Surrey has approved a plan to spend as much as $3.8 million on a pier to allow people to scatter the ashes of their loved ones into the Fraser River. The potential sites are Brownsville Bar Park and the Surrey Public Wharf. The pier would require provincial and federal approval. And now the forecast on the North Coast. Increasing cloudiness this afternoon with a high of 4. Highs around 5 with increasing cloudiness and strong winds in the Peace. In the central interior, including Prince George, mainly sunny with a high of 4. Highs up to 11 with some sunshine this afternoon in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, including Kelowna, mainly sunny with a high of 11 as well. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria, and the Fraser Valley, some sun and cloud this afternoon with highs around 12. That's your CBC News update from Vancouver.
Thank you very much, Rob.
You're welcome.
Rob Zimmerman in our CBC Vancouver newsroom. This is BC Today. I'm Michelle Elliott. Thanks so much for being with us. I hope you are staying dry. It is certainly a wet day out there, and lots more on the day's top stories coming up in your afternoon shows in your region. In Metro Vancouver, here's what's coming up on the Coast.
Michelle, hi there. It's Gloria Makarenko here, and hope you can join us for On the Coast this afternoon. And yes, we are all still waiting for the final election result. But in the meantime, we're introducing you to some of the newly elected members of the legislature. Former Langley Township Councillor, for example, Misty Van Popta, has been elected in Langley Walnut Grove. So she will be our guest on the show today. We'll hear more about her priorities for the region. Also, restaurants are struggling, and a growing number of restaurateurs from across the country have had to declare bankruptcy. So we'll get an update on the state of the industry on the program this afternoon. Please join us between 3 and 6 for On the Coast.
Gloria, thank you very much. That's Gloria Makarenko with On the Coast. You can hear that this afternoon on CBC Radio 1 in Metro Vancouver or anywhere on the CBC News app. And stay with us on our online platforms at 1 o'clock. David Eby is scheduled to address reporters. We'll bring that to you live. And again, that's on YouTube at CBC British Columbia and our streaming channel, CBC News BC. We'll have some analysis as well from a political scientist on Vancouver Island. Right now, we have been asking you the question of whether you think parties can work together in the legislature and how can we bridge polarization in BC. Again, our number is 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. Let's go to Clay now, who's been waiting patiently in Surrey. Hi, Clay.
Hi.
Thanks for calling. What are your thoughts?
I'm not so sure that any of these three parties are going to be able to actually collaboratively work together just because they're so diametrically opposed in mindset and in constituency. I think a lot of the problems are I'm going to echo, your guest there, is that we don't have enough split of the votes in a legislature. That way, and unfortunately, that leads to legislature that either excludes British Columbians and from other citizens in favor for whatever particular cause that legislation has been created. Just for example, the speculation tax. It was introduced, it was proposed, it was brought in by a majority government because they couldn't do it, during until they made an alliance with the Green parties. And when they brought that in there is a whole bunch of arbitrary type of clauses. You can't appeal decisions. If you're in a hospital, you're the only owner of a house.
Right. The speculation of vacancy tax.
They can charge you that tax.
Right. People were caught up in it. Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, if that was done with with a balance of power or equal sized parties, et cetera, I'm pretty certain some of those things would have been argued and tossed out of that legislation.
So is this, in a way, is this a kind of scenario that you would think to be better then? Because then there would really have to be, convincing of other parties.
Absolutely. I think this would be a way better setup for the legislature, just simply because legislation that's created would not be passed into law if it didn't consider other people in those mindsets or in those preferences.
Okay.
Such as, I'll just say carbon tax. Okay. Everybody, so many people hate the carbon tax. Lots of people think it's a great thing. Okay. It's probably a good thing, but it's a terrible thing when it isn't being applied to alternative sources of energy, et cetera, when it's just going into general revenue. So if there was equalization in the legislature, then those points might have been argued and hammered out and more easily balanced to represent British Columbians as a whole. Same as safe supply, the drugs, the safe supply. Soji, for example, many people don't like it.
You get more to the nuance of the issues.
Exactly. We would get more of a balance in the resulting legislation.
Okay.
Where I find a lot of the upset, no matter what side, I find the upset is because a lot of times the legislation and hence the laws don't consider the other side enough or at all.
Clay,
and that's what you get with majority government.
I hear you.
I
hear you.
Forward,
I have to jump in. I'm so sorry, Clay. I have to jump in just because we do have others who have been waiting as well. But I appreciate hearing from you. Thank you so much for that really interesting point. Doug is on the line now in Salmon Arm. Hi, Doug.
Hi there. How are you doing today?
I am well. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think this has been a very interesting program, so I just wanted to let you know that. But I generally am an optimist. But in terms of this, I'm a little cynical or I'm a bit of a pessimist. And part of the reason is because you have this massive rural versus urban divide. And I think, unfortunately, the people in the rural areas don't understand the urban issues and vice versa. The people in the urban area don't understand the rural divide. And you have the same thing in the House. And unfortunately, you have the Lower Mainland, you have Victoria, you have Kelowna, you have Kamloops, and you have Prince George. Those are primarily the urban areas, and that's what Victoria listens to, right? And as I was telling your producer, I tend to lean more towards the NDP. And one of the things they campaigned on was there's 20,000 seats that need to be filled in the schools. Surrey is the largest, fastest growing school district in the province. Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of that money that they're projecting to fill those 20,000 seats is going to go to Surrey. And I have no problem with that. But you get places like Fort St. John or Salmon Arm or Cranbrook or wherever, that might need that money just as much, but that money is staying in urban areas. Another example is, out here in the hinterland, a lot of the emergencies in the hospitals they have to close due to funding.
That's a big issue.
Whatever, right? And it's a huge issue. Yeah. But when you hear the government announce, okay, we're giving TransLink $500 million to extend the SkyTrain, which is needed, and I admit it's needed, what they are really saying is we don't care about the little communities, or that's the message that's coming from
Doug,
us. They may not be saying that.
really
but that's the
interesting point
message.
too. Yeah, really interesting point. Do rural voters feel heard and feel that their issues are paid enough attention to? And likewise, urban voters, depending on which party or which party we're talking about. Thank you so much. Thank you for raising that. We haven't heard that point yet. Trace is our final caller on this in Vancouver. Hi, Trace. Thanks so much for waiting.
You're welcome. I agree with. I'm concerned about the disinformation in politics, and I think we have to realize that facts, true information, come from science. For instance, climate change. I don't think people really understand how electromagnetic energy is absorbed by certain molecules like CO2. My passion is fundamental physics, and I've learned that it's paradoxic. It's both precise and uncertain, and it deals with probabilities. I think we need to improve our understanding of these subtleties, and that has to happen in our schools, elementary schools and high schools.
The education needs to improve.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think this show is great, a great forum. I've been so interested in listening to the other callers, but I think the media is at fault in not doing enough to talk about science. And the media always seems to look to the university for authority, and I think it's the departmentalization of the university that is partly responsible for our ignorance of science.
That is a really interesting point, Trace. Thank you very much, and fair point about media as well. Appreciate that. Thank you. That's Trace in Vancouver. Really good to hear from all of you on that. Some very fascinating takes on this question of polarization. Again, our email, bctoday@cbc.ca. 12:42 now, and speaking about climate change, let's talk about that atmospheric river this weekend. It dumped more than a month's worth of rain in southwestern BC. It led to widespread flooding. It led to some mudslides, and surging rivers. Now, and we are also hearing 2 people are confirmed dead, 2 more are missing. And there is also a power outage that's affecting dozens of people and a lot of damage. Of course, we want to hear from you. Do we need better planning for atmospheric rivers? You can give us a call, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can also hit pound 690 on your cell phone. For more on this, we're joined by Kai Chan, a professor with UBC's Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability. Hi there. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Michelle. It's a pleasure.
What do you take from the atmospheric river this weekend?
I got wet.
Yes.
On my bike, it was, it's crazy out there with the roads being flooded in places. I know I wasn't the only one who got wet. It's more of what we expected. We knew that we'd see these extreme rainfall events and that we'd be seeing more of them. So, it's not really a surprise, and we've got to be prepared to see even more of them in the future, perhaps coming more intensely and more often.
Right. And that's what we've been hearing, right? In North Vancouver, they were saying this is the kind of event that's sort of 1 in 100 years. And yet it's, this kind of flooding and slides happened just over a decade ago in North Vancouver. So should the goalposts be changing when it comes to understanding how frequently these may occur?
Absolutely. I mean, the science of it is hard, right? So we can never keep up with the rate of change that's happening now, but we should be expecting that when we're hearing that it's a once in a century, that chances are we'll probably see it within a decade or so at this point. For many of these climate-associated events where you would expect when the atmosphere is warmer, it can hold more water, it's more likely that we will have these kinds of atmospheric river events.
It also strikes me, Professor Chan, that, in the climate change discussion over the last few years, we have been talking about how these events are affecting people in the southern hemispheres, the more vulnerable countries and regions. And yet here in BC, we have seen it at our doorstep, and now here we are. It almost seems like we have become used to it. I mean, the atmospheric river in 2021 was it caused so much damage in the interior, in the Fraser Valley, and there's been attention to this past weekend, but it also seems like it's become, I don't know, accepted that it's going to happen.
Yeah, happens, right? People are incredibly adaptable. We get used to new normals,
Yeah, yeah.
sometimes too quickly. And I think over a decade ago, we imagined that parts of Canada, the most of Canada actually, would be experiencing relatively little in the way of problems associated with climate change. I think many of us thought that it would be a kind of a nice warming, right? And that isn't what we've seen at all. But in the last few years, yeah, we've become used to, in a problematic way, droughts, floods, fires, all of these extreme events that are happening much more frequently than they used to, and we can expect that that will continue over the coming decades due to climate change. I don't know. Human psychology is working against us here.
How should planning adapt?
More expectation of these events and an understanding that when things go wrong, that many different problems can co-occur, right? I think academically we know that that's the case, right? So when you've got a flood, you can have bridges being washed out, right? Like those kinds of combined events, you can have power outages. I think that cities are starting to plan that way, but we haven't really, sadly, actually.
Pardon me, would you mind
apart-
repeating that? We just cut out for a moment there.
Oh, I'm sorry. When we, it's what makes it really difficult and dangerous, right? When we have a bridge that gets washed out during a flooding event, when we have power going out, when we have a natural gas pipeline leak, right? All of those things could, in theory, co-occur, and we need to plan that they are likely to when we have events like we are having.
My apologies. There seems to be a bit of a connection issue with our professor, our guest here, Professor Kai Chan. And I'm just going to try another question here for you then. Let's talk more about that planning. You know, when it comes to atmospheric rivers, what could municipalities be doing? If they are preparing, what could they be changing around or planning for, given this may occur, sooner than expected?
In the long term, we need to start planning hydrologically quite differently. We need to be routing the water safely in ways that is going through ecosystems rather than being channeled entirely through human-built structures. That's going to take a long time because we've had many decades where we've been burying our streams and channelizing our rivers. So returning to a kind of development where there is space for rivers to flood, that's going to be very difficult. But ultimately, I think that's the way to do it because control the water in those quantities if we try to do it through purely engineered solutions alone.
And so what other solutions do there need to be then outside of engineering solutions?
I mean, I guess they're ecologically engineered, right?
Yeah.
So like rain gardens and resurfacing streams, restoring natural flows to rivers and streams. So many of the streams in Vancouver have been buried, and in that way, that means all the water is coming off the roads, right? In ways that we're not used to. It's flooding the storm drains and causing combined sewer overflows. These are big problems that would take many, many millions, if not billions of dollars to fix through purely engineered solutions. So, the more that we can relieve the pressure, the water pressure on those storm drains, the better we'll be.
Is there still a mitigation, a climate change mitigation approach here? Is this now going to be a matter of adaptation? Is it too late?
Thinking long term. over the coming decades, we are absolutely going to see warming associated with the emissions that have already occurred in the past. So adaptation is absolutely necessary, and not just adaptation to get to the warming where we're seeing today, but for another half degree at least that is in the pipeline. But beyond that, when we're thinking about decades from now, if we don't seriously work on the mitigation side, then we're going to be doubling the challenge of adaptation, because the warming will be so much greater, and we're much more likely to get into those self-reinforcing feedbacks where we have runaway climate change. So mitigation, more essential than ever. Adaptation, obviously crucial and likely to increase.
And so, given that, we're still awaiting the final results of the provincial election, but what are your thoughts, given that, one of the emails I read earlier said that the ecological crisis was not a priority for the NDP or the Conservatives, and the Conservatives don't see it as a crisis. What are your thoughts about what kind of focus is going to be on climate change mitigation in the next government?
We don't even know which the next government will be. So but I mean, I will just say I have trouble understanding why we could turn away from strong carbon pollution policy, like the carbon tax. There's a lot of bad press that the carbon tax has received, but this is a revenue neutral tax. Lots of people are actually benefiting from the carbon tax. It is not hurting working class families for the most part the way that it has been maligned. We have a bias against taxes that is just rooted in our basic psychology. And we're not recognizing the gains that we get from these policies. They're really important to recognize. This is doing important work, and it's being demonized through politics that people are absorbing instead of really understanding the policy and how it's working.
Kai Chan, thank you so much for your time. I do apologize for some of that, the technical issues that we had there, but we did hear the most of your points. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Kai Chan is professor with UBC's Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability. It's 12:52 now. Coming up in just under 10 minutes, NDP leader David Eby will be speaking to reporters. He'll hold a press conference, and we'll bring that to you live online on YouTube, and that's at CBC British Columbia. You can also catch it on our streaming channel, and that is CBC News BC. We were asking you about polarization earlier on in the program, and Scott writes us. So pardon me, we have some emails, in fact, on the atmospheric river question. Scott wrote us, in BC, we will encounter increased frequency of both floods, droughts, and forest fires. One of the most important things we can do today to prepare is to install distributed grid batteries to maintain electricity for a location when a disaster hits. More battery energy storage systems are required. Thank you so much for that email, Scott. Interesting point there. And on our first question to you, which was about, do you think the parties can work together in the legislature, and how can we bridge that polarization among BC's electorate? Squire wrote us, I don't think it's a big divide. I think it was pretty hysterical that we had a lack of choice. BC United should have stayed in the race. Otherwise, we will continue to frame this as a divide. People wanted choice, but the right, quote, united, albeit it was a messy unification. We also need electoral reform. It is odd to hear that British Columbians surveyed back in 2018 said they want to continue to stick with first past the post. It is outdated and forces voters to be strategic rather than go with what best aligns with their values. Jonathan writes, if we had a proportional representation system, we would already know the results. 43 seats for the NDP, 42 for the Conservatives, and 8 seats for the Greens. It's crazy that the control of government hinges on just a few hundred votes in a few ridings. The Greens received 8% of the votes, but have only won 2% of the seats in the first past the post system by riding. How is this fair or democratic? Drew writes, I'm not really sure how the BC NDP and the BC Conservatives can work together, no matter who ends up winning the election, because John Rustad already hinted he would overthrow the governing party as soon as he can. If he loses, I'm not sure the Conservatives could win the Greens to support him due to his radical policies, especially the carbon tax. I can tell you, having volunteered in this election, a lot of BC NDP supporters went to the Greens because of the carbon tax, and they felt, quote, our candidate would win anyway, and or the BC NDP will win the election handily, so why would I vote NDP if the NDP would scrap the tax? Don writes, simply look at the blue wave. I'm tired of every decision made by the NDP benefiting everything south of the Port Mann Bridge. Simply look at how many good paying forestry jobs are gone because of poor forestry practices and high stumpage. I live in Grand Isle, and it's where I can afford a home. The nearest grocery store is 100 kilometers one way. It's time that the election system in BC is changed to fairly represent all of BC and not just the small area south of the Port Mann. BC's GDP comes from its resources, not the large urban centers. Thank you so much for your emails. We're at bctoday@cbc.ca. And if you are able to watch us online, coming up again at 1 o'clock, David Eby will be speaking. Well, this morning, BC Conservative leader John Rustad, yesterday morning, told CBC's Stephen Quinn how his party will respond to the final results, whatever they may be.
My hope is, come Saturday, that the Conservative Party will have the opportunity to form a government.
Of course.
That's my hope. And so we'll see what comes out of that. Should we still be in the minority situation, we will be looking and working with other MLAs, Green Party or others, to look at an opportunity to be able to govern in this province. Should we end up in a situation where there's a minority government of the NDP that is in power in British Columbia, if they're carrying forward with the policies that they are promising to do, which have brought so much destruction and pain in this province, especially to our resource sector in British Columbia. And no, I cannot support that, and I will try to bring their government down at the earliest possible opportunity.
Okay, and so in the meantime, though, if you do not get the votes, do you plan to court the Green Party to try to get them on side so you can govern?
Well, there's clearly lots of differences between the Green Party platform and the Conservative Party platform. So, however, there are some things that we could find in terms of common ground. So we're going to be open to having conversations. We haven't blocked off any sort of ideas, whether that's working with the Green Party or others in the legislature that could potentially form an opportunity to govern in British Columbia.
That's John Rustad speaking yesterday, the Conservative leader speaking on the early edition yesterday. And we are just about leading up to 1 o'clock here. And of course, we will carry live for you the press conference with David Eby. Thanks so much for all of your calls and your emails today here on the program, bctoday@cbc.ca. You can always let us know what you think of anything you hear on the show. Our email again is bctoday@cbc.ca. Thank you for joining us. We'll sign off for our radio listeners, but do join us online in just a moment for our continuing coverage of the BC election. And David Eby scheduled to speak in just a minute. I'm Michelle Elliott. Have a good afternoon. Well, the results of the BC election still are not final. It is a close race at this point. That final count will be conducted this weekend. Now, NDP leader David Eby is scheduled to speak to reporters any moment now, and we'll take you there live as soon as it begins. He's speaking in Vancouver. Right now, I'm joined by Daniel Reeve, political scientist at Camosun College, for some context on this. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Well, what are you expecting? If you can speculate a little bit here, but what are you expecting from David Eby in a moment here?
Well, I think he's going to say some of the things he said before. Wow, that was really close. Also, that's humbling, and I think that's a message he'll repeat. But I think he's also going to be talking about, if the numbers hold, what the future might hold. I know that the NDP would be keen to probably get on with a unprecedented third term, albeit a fairly humbled one. And I think that'll be part of the message is what it would look like to make agreements with very likely the Greens if the numbers hold as they are.
He is still premier at this point. And let's just, in fact, David Eby is starting to speak now. Let's go live.
This afternoon, but before I do, I have an update about the impacts of the atmospheric river on British Columbians. I'm advised by Public Service that the atmospheric river had devastating impacts on many people, many properties in multiple locations across the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island. We now have confirmation from police that at least 3 people have died related to the impacts of the atmospheric river. There's also one person who remains missing. The first death was a woman in Coquitlam whose home was destroyed by a mudslide. The second was a man near Port Alberni on Banfield Road whose vehicle was submerged. And the third is a missing man who likely perished in his vehicle while driving from Port Alberni to Victoria. We are awaiting confirmation of identity and details related to that death. There is a missing man currently in Coquitlam who was walking his dog by the riverside. The dog has been found alive, but troublingly, the dog was very wet, and the man is missing. The last potential death is there was a death of a man in the Columbia Valley that may be associated with the atmospheric river, and the coroner is investigating that death and the cause of death. My heart goes out to the families of those who are missing, who have died. It's devastating for them and for their communities. The shock, I'm sure, is overwhelming, and I know where we don't have answers yet, the waiting must be excruciating. The Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Response is working with local governments to identify any potential damage to local government infrastructure and to support them and First Nations with response to flooding events. For British Columbians, the rains continue. Please be extremely cautious around rivers and waterways. Check drivebc.ca for information about highway access and road access. And emergencyinfobc.ca is also a good source of information for British Columbians. So that is the end of the update on the atmospheric river, and I'm happy to take questions from the media about any other number of topics.
Thank you for joining us. Members of the media on the phone line, please press *1 to enter the queue. All members of the media will be limited to 1 question and 1 follow-up. We're going to begin on the floor today with Richard Zussman with Global News. Go ahead, Richard.
You barely held on to this job. There are still counting being done. You lost 16 incumbents, including 5 ministers. What went so wrong?
Well, the counting does continue, and we're not taking anything for granted. But it's pretty clear to me that British Columbians sent me a strong message that we need to do better. And in particular, on issues of affordability, the challenges that families are facing, on issues of public safety in our community. And my commitment to British Columbians is I take those lessons very seriously. And currently, we are working and preparing, without taking anything for granted, that if the counts come back for a minority government or for an NDP majority government, that we're going to put those lessons into practice right away, working for British Columbians, and get to work for them because they can't afford to wait.
You talk about right away. In the United Kingdom, when there was a minority government, they got back to work within 19 days. Is there an obligation here to get back to Victoria to attempt to show you have confidence of the House as quickly as possible? Or do you believe you can wait until the new year, budget season, in order to come back? Is there a commitment to come back and prove right away that you are able to continue to have confidence of the House?
Well, I think British Columbians want us to get to work right away on the issues that they're concerned about. That's certainly the message that I took, the urgency around healthcare. You know, we're going into cold and flu season, making sure that we're addressing those issues around affordability, delivering on our commitments related to that in the election. And of course, public safety and communities. These are all huge and pressing priorities for British Columbians, so we want to get to work on that as soon as possible. It is very likely that we will need the support of other MLAs to pass legislation, to do the work that we need to do. And what that looks like, we'll be entering into discussions as we go forward about how we find that cooperation in the legislature. But my commitment is to British Columbians that we will be working immediately to deliver for them.
Our next question will come from Lauren Stallone from City News. Go ahead, Lauren.
Have you started having those conversations with the Greens that were mentioned on Saturday night?
I reached out to the leader of the Green Party, Sonia Furstenau, immediately after the election to congratulate her on her campaign on electing 2 MLAs. I thought she ran a principled and values-based campaign that obviously spoke to British Columbians and many communities across the province. The Greens have advised us that they are not ready yet to engage in those conversations, but we are preparing for what we hope is the likely outcome of the counting without taking anything for granted. We're making sure that we're ready to go. We have a team in place to engage in conversations with MLAs about how we're going to move forward on this, including with the Green Party, and nothing's off the table. We'll have those conversations, and we'll find a way to make the legislature work for British Columbians on the priorities that they sent us back to Victoria to work on.
And Laura, do you have a follow-up question?
The NDP has lost significant ground in Surrey compared to previous elections. What do you think contributed to this?
Yeah, I think there was a strong message from many different parts of the province, to me, to our government, that the expectations that British Columbians have are that we do better. And I feel that. I feel like in the last 72 hours, I've learned as much about this job as I have in the previous 2 years. It is a moment for me to take stock about how we ensure that we're delivering for British Columbians on these critical issues, and a clear message that I have heard, and I'm looking forward to putting into practice with my team if the count goes in the direction that we hope it does, and we're able to work with other MLAs to deliver for British Columbians.
Our next question will come from Michelle Gamage from Tyee. Go ahead, Michelle.
Moving on to tobacco now. So we've got that big vote in December, whether we want to sign on to the settlement or not. Is BC in or out, and why or why not?
So I am really proud of the work that was started a generation ago by a BC NDP government to initiate litigation against these tobacco firms. They brought so much death and misery and destruction to our province and to people and to families as they covered up evidence about the impact of tobacco. They're finally being held accountable, just like we're holding opioid manufacturers accountable as well, in terms of the financial impact that they had on people, because we can never bring the lives back. The work was exhaustive around the table, involving many provinces, and my hope is we can get this agreement across the line and ensure that that at least some recognition of the impact that tobacco companies have had on British Columbians and all Canadians is realized.
And Michelle, do you have a follow-up question?
Okay, so it sounds like BC's in favor.
Sorry, I'll
but
just say yes. Yes, we are in favor.
32.5 billion is a fraction of the 600 billion that was asked for. So if we're in, what kind of services could BC be losing out on because the offer is so short if they ask?
Well, there's no question that the compensation from these companies is not going to approach even a fraction of the impact that they had on Canadians, just like in other jurisdictions where they've been sued as well. In addition, these companies, their financial solvency is in question. There is a distinct possibility of Canadians receiving nothing. So there's this balance that has to be struck. And my hope is that this settlement agreement is one that can provide some recognition while knowing that that is not going to provide even close to full compensation for the impact on British Columbians and Canadians.
Our next question will come from Brianna Charlebois from Canadian Press. Go ahead, Brianna.
Great, thank you so much. You've had a couple days now to reflect on what happened on election night and on the campaign in general. So I'm wondering, in hindsight, do you have any regrets perhaps around focusing so much on Rustad and calling him and his team conspiracy theorists or worse, instead of focusing on the NDP accomplishments and promises?
Yeah, I think the campaign was one that was aiming to communicate to British Columbians a couple of things. And it's the same message going forward. I have one responsibility, and that is to ensure that the interests and priorities of British Columbians are delivered in the legislature every single day. And as we move forward, that commitment that I made during the campaign is the commitment that I'm making today and going forward. I heard loud and clear the message from British Columbians on voting day. They want us to do better. They want us to deliver for them on their priorities of affordability and public safety and support of rural communities. A huge number of lessons for us to take from the election, and I look forward to putting those into practice in the legislature. Without taking anything for granted about how the count may go, we are ready to go. We are organizing and preparing. If the count does go towards a minority parliament or an NDP majority parliament, that we are able to deliver for British Columbians.
And Brianna, do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, thank you so much. In the last couple of days of the campaign, you were urging voters to reject the Greens and instead vote NDP. How do you now go to the Greens and ask for their support?
Yeah, I think in the mirror, the Greens were encouraging people to reject the NDP and vote for the Greens. That's how election campaigns go. But one thing that I'm certain on is that British Columbians voted in the majority for a progressive vision for our province. And we have a lot of shared values in common with the Green Party that form a foundation for the conversations that we'll have to have with them and with MLAs across the legislature to ensure that we're able to deliver for British Columbians on their priorities.
Great. And going to the phone lines now, we have Mira Baines from CBC. Go ahead, Mira.
Sure. Thank you for taking my question. John Rustad is telling his candidates not to throw away their election signs in case there's another election soon. He says he'll do anything to trigger another election if he's in the position of opposition. What are you telling your candidates at this point about an election in the near future? Are you telling them to save their signs as well?
We'll see what the ballots that have yet to be opened hold for British Columbia in terms of the path forward. Every vote is going to be counted and every vote's going to matter, and we'll respect that. If we're sent back to Parliament with a minority or with a majority, my commitment is very straightforward. We're going to make that Parliament work for British Columbians. We're going to do what's necessary to work with MLAs to deliver on affordability, on issues of public safety, a strong public health care system, and a positive vision for our province that ensures that the views of British Columbians are supported.
And Mira, do you have a follow-up question?
Sure. This is just on another matter on the atmospheric river. Do you think that there should be a better, more coordinated system of warning people when something like this happens in light of these deaths?
Well, I think that there's always lessons for us anytime a life is lost due to natural disaster or there's significant property damage. We always go back and do a review. What did we learn? How can we do things better? We did that with the forest fire season. And our task force implemented a number of changes that, despite the devastation of this year's forest fire season, avoided the kind of catastrophic impacts we'd seen from previous seasons. And so for the atmospheric river, while the search and rescue teams are still out there and they're searching for people, I want to encourage them to continue that important work, and all British Columbians to be cautious while the rain is still falling. We will be reviewing and ensuring that any lessons that can be taken here about future rainfall or flooding-related incidents are taken into account in terms of the specific deaths we saw here.
Our next question will come from Rob Buffum from CTV News. Go ahead, Rob.
Oh, hi. Thanks for taking my question. I'm wondering, some trust has been broken with the Greens. We were in the situation in 2017, and when ACASA was signed there, your party did scrap that prematurely. And then, as referenced earlier, at the latter part of this campaign, actively you were dissuading, you're trying to encourage people not to vote for them. What kind of concessions would you have to make or be willing to make to get them to come back to your side, especially if it was on more than a vote by vote basis, given there is some ill will there?
Well, Rob, we'll see where the votes end up. We'll ensure that every vote is counted and the will of the voters is respected in this province. And if they send us back to the Parliament with a minority or with a majority government, we will work, and we're preparing right now to be able to hit the ground running to address the issues that British Columbians will have sent us to Victoria to deliver for them. And we will work with the Green MLAs, we'll work with MLAs to ensure that we're able to deliver that for British Columbians.
And Rob, do you have a follow-up question?
Right. I do. When you say, you've learned or feel like you understand you need to do better, what are you referring to there? Is there part of that relates to the campaign tone that may have backfired and turned people off in terms of all the negativity? In terms of your agenda, it was a very specific, very bold agenda in terms of housing and other. So you certainly didn't lack for ambition.
Yeah, I think Rob, when I reflect on what people told me both during the campaign and through their vote, it's that they are profoundly concerned about our healthcare system. They want their emergency rooms open and running. They want their family doctor, and anything less is unacceptable. That when it comes to their downtowns, they want to feel safe with their kids going downtown. When they run a business downtown, they don't want to be dealing with someone struggling with a brain injury, mental health issue, and addiction. That's not their business. Their business is to sell whatever it is that they're selling. And so that's a message that I got loud and clear. And I think that John Rustad spoke very effectively to British Columbians about those frustrations. And that's a lesson that I take, that we didn't do enough. And we've got to do more to make sure that we're supporting those kinds of communities, those kinds of strong public services that people are looking for. And we're going to do that.
Our next question will come from Justine Hunter from the Globe and Mail. Go ahead, Justine.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on the first question there, which was around, are you committed to a fall session? I think you are, but I just want to be clear on that.
Well, I don't want to prejudge the conversations that we're going to have with MLAs. The Greens have asked for time before those conversations start. They're going to take the time that they need. For the piece that's my world, for our NDP MLAs, for our team, whatever the final configuration looks like after the count, we are doing the work right now to be prepared to be ready to go on day one. And that's ready to go to deliver for British Columbians on the priorities they set out for us. And we're happy to work with MLAs to deliver that vision in a number of different configurations. Nothing is off the table. And we'll make sure that those conversations can take place, and we can do that work as quickly as possible for British Columbians. We can't waste a moment. People are feeling this now. They want us to work now. Life is happening in real time here for everybody else in the province, and we got to make sure that we're keeping up to that as government, whatever the final configuration is that's sent to Victoria.
And Justine, do you have a follow-up question?
Thank you. Can you deliver some promises without going back into the House? I'm thinking of the grocery rebate, for example.
Sorry, Justine, the whole first part of your question cut out. Can you start again?
I know this line is terrible. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Can you deliver some of the major platform promises without legislation? For example, the grocery rebate.
There are major commitments that, of course, will require budgeting and all of that process, which requires a vote and a confidence vote in the legislature. There are other pieces that can be delivered without that. But the configuration of MLAs that will be sent to the legislature has not been determined yet. What we're doing right now is we're preparing so that we can have those conversations with MLAs about delivering on those priorities as quickly as possible, because that's what I believe British Columbians want. They want us to ensure that we're supporting them on those issues that they identified for us, and we'll do that work to make sure that we're doing that as effectively as possible with the people who've been elected.
Our next question will come from Les Lane from the Times Columnist. Go ahead, Les.
Oh, thank you. Premier, you said you don't want to prejudge the conversations with the Greens, but I can do that for you. They're going to demand another move towards proportional representation, either directly or by referendum. What's your kind of initial view on that topic coming up again?
Yeah, I won't speculate less on what the Greens are prioritizing for their constituents and for the communities where they were elected. They'll come to the table with their requests and their suggestions and their views, and whatever the configuration is that British Columbians have sent to the legislature, we'll work with MLAs, including Green MLAs, to deliver a legislature that works for British Columbians. And that's my goal, is that the people who are elected, that we're working together to deliver for British Columbians on the priorities they sent us to work on.
And Les, do you have a follow-up question?
No, I pass. Thanks.
Thanks, Les. We have time for one more question. We'll go to Wolf Deppner from Black Press. Go ahead, Wolf.
Yes, good afternoon, Premier. Thank you for taking my questions. What happens if one, maybe two of those seats subject to recount flip towards the Conservatives? How would that change your calculus?
Well, Wolf, it's hard to know what's in the envelopes of the mail-in ballots and the work that Elections BC is doing right now, so I won't speculate about that. What I can tell you for certain is that whoever from the BC NDP team is elected, I've been in touch with all of my new colleagues, all of my returning colleagues, and our commitment is united, which is that we are all focused on making sure that the legislature works for British Columbians on the priorities that they sent us to work on. And whatever role British Columbians want us to play in terms of that final count, we're going to play that role. And if it's a minority parliament, we're going to do all we can to make sure that it works and delivers on those priorities for British Columbians.
And Wolf, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, I do. Jeff Meggs has called this election a wake-up call, and he also argued that your party now has to deliver, to execute on its promises. How do you plan to do that? With a minority parliament, your government had a majority. Now you could find yourself in a minority. How do you plan to accomplish something with a minority that perhaps you didn't achieve with a majority? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I agree with Jeff's assessment. You know, I heard a loud message from British Columbians on election night, and they expect us to deliver the basics. Strong public healthcare system, safe communities, strong prosperous economy that supports people, and affordability that is meaningful for them in their lives. And we're going to make sure that we work with the MLAs who share that vision about those priorities to accomplish that for British Columbians.
We're going to squeeze in one more question from Alec Lazenby from the Vancouver Sun. Go ahead, Alec.
Hi, Premier. You keep talking about, you said it on election night, you said today multiple times that we need to do better. How much of that falls at your feet? Like, what lessons are you taking away from this? And how much of, what ended up as being a very, very close election falls at your feet?
Yeah, I'm the leader of the party. I take responsibility for the message that we received from British Columbians that we didn't do well enough, that we need to do more, that they want us to do more. And it is obviously a tough message to hear, but I heard it. And my commitment is to take that message to Victoria in whatever configuration of MLAs has been sent to deliver on those priorities British Columbians want us to focus on.
And Alex, do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask what you know of Jeremy Valeroy and, Rob Botterill. Assuming results stay the same, you'll have to be working very, very closely with them. What's your impression of them so far? I know you haven't started negotiations with the Greens, but at this point, what do you feel like are some common ground that you can make?
Yeah, I reached out to both Jeremy and Rob to congratulate them on their successful campaigns. They obviously spoke to the community in a way that resonated for residents there, and they ran a very strong campaign. We had great candidates in both communities, and who also ran very good campaigns, and both Rob and Jeremy were successful. So I look forward to working with them and with MLAs in the legislature, with the Green Party, to ensure that that we're delivering on the priorities that they were elected to work on, and the priorities that I believe the NDP was elected to work on, and all MLAs in the legislature, which are the priorities of British Columbians.
And that's all the time we have today. Thank you for joining us, everyone.
Thanks very much, everyone.
That is BC NDP leader David Eby. And Premier, he does remain Premier and will have the chance to test the confidence in the House. As you heard, lessons learned. British Columbia has sent a loud message, those words from David Eby this afternoon, also saying that his party is preparing for what they hope to be the outcome of the election. They hope it is a minority NDP government or a majority NDP government. He says they have reached out to the Green Party. The Green Party has said they're not ready to engage in any conversations about an agreement just yet. Let's go to Daniel Reeve, political scientist at Camosun College, who has been listening and watching and taking lots of notes, I know. What are your impressions of what David Eby had to say?
Well, there was one thing that really jumped out to me. I mean, he was hitting on the key ideas. He kept saying, hit the ground running, affordability, public safety. He even complimented Rustad on his message around public safety, which was an interesting concession. But I thought the most interesting thing he said actually was, you know, in the last 2 days, I've learned more about being Premier than I have in the last 2 years. Now, it may have just been a turn of phrase, but I think he's either means it or he kind of is trying to say, like, this is a humbling event and I'll be a different Premier. And I thought that was kind of the heart of his messaging, is that if he gets a chance to govern either with a majority or more likely with a minority government, I think he's trying to say, I'm going to be a new person with greater focus on these core issues. The challenge is that some of these core issues are going to run right against a lot of the ideas that the Greens might want to go with. And so if they do eventually head into negotiations, if the numbers hold, how are they going to pursue these core issues while also appeasing, this powerful two-person caucus of the Greens?
Right. So that's a really interesting point. And he was asked as well, what might be those concessions if he were to pursue that agreement with the Greens? What would he have to concede on? Proportional representation was one that came up in the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, if they're in a minority government position, they're probably not well positioned to even impose or even bring in the discussion. On the other hand, they could just say, look, if they can get 3 or 4 years out of this, which I think would be their goal, is to get a lot. They don't want to govern for 18 months. I think they're looking to govern for longer than that. I think if later down the road they can say, sure, we'll give you a referendum on whatever type of government or electoral system you'd like, but it's essentially a nonpartisan activity. I think they might be willing to do that. But the problem is that in the past, when we've had alternative voting systems suggested, the referendums have typically killed them.
Yeah. What about some of those tougher issues? You've positioned it very well there, that, there's, on the one hand, he says he's going to work on those issues, affordability being one of them, public safety, at the same time, try to appease these two Green MLAs, Jeremy Valeriot and Rob Botterill. On those issues, they're very far apart from the Conservatives. So you talk about, for example, the carbon tax or safe supply or involuntary treatment, for example. How can, and public safety and affordability, those two things. So how can David Eby speak to the voters who did vote for the Conservatives, presumably concerned about those issues?
So I think affordability was an issue for a lot of voters, regardless of political stripe. I think, like if you were going to, if I was in the room there, I would imagine that what I might hear is, look, we'll hold on the carbon tax because, frankly, the promise of receding the personal carbon tax was contingent on the federal government essentially changing the tune. It's probably very unlikely that will happen until the next federal election, where it looks very likely that the Conservatives would form government. But I do think that the more challenging issue, I think they can make those concessions on environmental issues because some of their supporters were disappointed with the choices they made on those issues. I think it's going to be tougher when you get to the kind of public safety, whether it's around the Class A drugs and kind of the handling of addiction issues, involuntary care. This is where the Greens really staked out a position that was much more to the left, the political, away from the sort of populist sentiment. And sort of I think the real stumbling point would be ideas around public safety. He talked the story about going downtown and feeling safe in your downtown community. The downtown communities are where their voters are. And so obviously that's an important part of, meeting the demands of Surrey, of Coquitlam, of Victoria, Vancouver. Like, this is his base. Like, these are the areas he needs to win. And so I think that will be one of the tension points if they do get into negotiations, is around public safety, because I think he's going to want to move on those issues. And I think the Greens have a very different belief system when it comes to those issues.
And all of this was, as he kept saying, assuming the count holds, don't want to take anything for granted. And he was asked, what if the votes flip, right? So a couple of those ridings. So I'll ask you the same thing on the other side. John Rustad, should he be governing, how can he speak to the 44.5% of voters who did vote for the NDP? How can he speak to those voters as well?
Well, I'm pretty sure he wouldn't be bringing in a proportional representative system to one. I think if the two ridings flip, which I think would be a pretty big if, but if they did, they would just plow ahead with government. They feel like they have the momentum on their side, and I think that for the time being, I think they wouldn't. He wants, as he said, a do-over, although that means a re-election, and he wants it as fast as possible. The populist wins at the federal level couldn't be growing stronger for the Conservatives, and I think he knows that's the win that's filling much of his sails. That's why he's so keen to have another election if he doesn't form government. But if he forms government, I don't think they're going to think twice about the constituents who didn't vote for them. And even though that constituents is a greater number than the number that actually voted for the Conservatives.
And I'll just wrap up going back to our earlier conversation in our program. We talked about the polarization in this province. What are your thoughts? How can we bridge those divides among the electorate?
Turn off our phones.
Social media, really, then.
I think it's one of the deciding factors. I teach a course on digital media or digital politics, and one of the things you can see where the influence of social media since 2007 is what used to be the center used to be the political target for all the parties. And as social media has evolved, and we all know about the algorithms and the pulling apart of it, and how these algorithms and the profit that goes with it, aggregates anger, aggregates hostility, that we've seen the political middle shrink, whether it's in the United States or really anywhere around the world, and the rise on the more extreme sides. And I think it's getting harder to speak to the middle. I think actually, in many ways, Eby's campaign was trying to seek out the middle, but for a lot of people, that wasn't a convincing appeal. Like, he moved to the center on a variety of points. And that didn't resonate in the way that I think it might have resonated 20 years ago. And I think that has a lot to do with how we receive our information, the sources, the everything to the blips we get, like literally the 10 or 20 second clips we get instead of a longer discussion, to just how the mathematics of the information feeds we all get divides us.
Daniel Reeve, always good to speak with you. Thanks so much for spending quite a bit of time with us here. Appreciate it.
Oh, always a pleasure.
Daniel Reeve is a political scientist at Camosun College. And this has been an extension of BC Today to bring you a live press conference from David Eby. Stay tuned. Stay with us on CBC News BC. We'll have more news updates coming to you next. I'm Michelle Elliott. Thanks for joining us.